Hi, this is Bruce Rawles, and I'm speaking again with Dr. Bob Rosenthal, who is the author of several books about A Course in Miracles, and the latest of which we've been talking in a couple of previous segments. The book is From Loving One to One Love, Transforming Relationships Through A Course in Miracles. And as I was telling Bob before we started the recording, I'm loving this book immensely, and reading more each time I read a few more chapters, it's like, wow, it's so well written, and I would recommend this to both seasoned course students as well as newbies, as well as anyone just slightly interested in what the course is about. Because it really, you do a fabulous job, Bob, of sharing what the course is all about, and both in depth and breadth, as well as making it very accessible and very easy to read and relatable. And so anyway, kudos.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're basically telling me I actually did manage to succeed at the task I set to myself, even though through the entire writing of it, I was pretty sure I hadn't.
Well, I think it's kind of a reminder that, if we get ourselves out of the way, good stuff comes through, right?
Well, it's the author's dilemma, too much self-consciousness. And I mean that word in multiple ways.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so the sections I have been reading up through, let's see, I guess it's about chapters 12 through 13, and 12, 13, 14, and 15, since we last had a conversation, like forgiving the unforgivable. That's certainly when we were just kind of touching on that, I think a little bit of picking our favorite scapegoats and media figures, political figures, that sort of thing, and just recognizing that those are just as amenable to forgiveness as the what we think of as easily forgivable because of the course's no order of difficulties or magnitude principle, I suppose, right?
Yeah. Well, it's in the nature of the ego, and it's in the nature of, all of us to not necessarily rank order our forgiveness opportunities, our forgiveness lessons, but to have some sense of, oh, that's impossible, I could never forgive that person, to, oh yeah, that's easy, I've already forgiven them, without the recognition that any block to forgiveness, any grievance is equally detrimental to awakening to the nature of your true self, which necessarily includes that other person. So, to the extent that there's even a judgment and we see them as different, we're getting in the way of our own awakening. Now, as easy to say, not easy to do, and it takes a great deal of practice. But in a way, it's almost a corollary of the idea that I think I talked about in an earlier chapter, that, every relationship the ego makes is a special relationship. We might see some, oh, I'm so in love with that human being, that as the epitome of special relationships. But the ego only knows specialness in special relationships. And a grievance is a form of a special relationship. We single one person out because of something they did or didn't do and hold it against them. Well, that's specialness. It's just bad specialness, negative specialness. So all the ego's relationships are special. All the Holy Spirit's relationships are holy because they're all, really the same. And therefore, there's no such thing as the unforgivable, although we will see certain things as more difficult to forgive than others, which is absolutely fine. I always like to go to the weightlifting metaphor. You don't walk into, and I'm not a weightlifter, so this is not coming from experience, but you don't walk into the gym and say, hey, load up 300 pounds, let me see what I can do. You're going to find you can't do it, and you're going to probably hurt yourself. Whereas if you start with those things that you feel you can do, those relationships where the forgiveness is clear, or the forgiveness opportunities are clear, and your sense is they're within reach, then you're building your forgiveness muscles.
Yeah. I think that's pretty normal and appropriate to give ourselves slack for the things that we think are too challenging, and just be patient and gently vigilant as we go through the process.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else on forgiving the unforgivable?
Well, it's I was really looking at almost these ideological positions that many of us take about things that, okay, so in the previous chapter, we were talking about forgiveness as release from the past, that,
Mm-hmm.
that the past is what hardens a grievance, the past is where a grievance is formed. And if we continue to live with the grievance, we're continuing to live in the past and not in the present. So in the unforgivable, grievances section, and I'm sorry I bungled the name of the chapter, forgiving the unforgivable. I wanted to look at those sort of racial or collective grievances that seem so big that how could anyone forgive them? When people say, how can you forgive Hitler? They're really personifying in the name Hitler or the face Hitler an entire collective grievance against the Nazi Party, the Holocaust, and all they did.
Mm-hmm.
Of all of them, this probably seems to make the most sense. How can anyone forgive a being that instigated and perpetrated genocide?
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, we could extend it, to Pol Pot or
Yeah.
Rwanda. I mean, sadly, genocide does seem to be a thing in human history. But if our goal is to really, if we recognize that every example of forgiveness is a wound to our own being because, we're not at peace, then we have to look at these, bigger grievances in the same way that we would look at the a-hole who cut us off on the road, or, or our partner who had an expression on their face that we didn't like,
Which is probably more frequent than the other
You got it.
in light of recent travel practices, right?
but so, I tell a story in there, one which is within my family about my grandfather when he was still in Russia under the Tsars, being attacked by a bunch of boys who called him Christ killer,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of that calumny, that accusation from the New Testament, the book of the Gospel of John, I believe, where, the Jews killed Christ, and how that has locked in and really is the basis of all of the anti-Semitism that flowed from it. And I sort of tell this really quite lovely story, at least for me, of how in this one instance, there was a forgiveness opportunity that took place that gave it all a happy ending, which doesn't always happen. And then I shared a story from psychiatrist Stan Groff, who wrote an amazing autobiography called When the Impossible Happens, that if you want something that's just going to blow your mind, it's not Course in Miracles, but what some of the things that he's done and gone through are really pretty out there. It's a worthwhile book. And this was a story about doing a sweat lodge ceremony with peyote, with the Potawatomi tribe, and how one of the people in that tribe just was beaming hatred at him.
Mm-hmm.
I might as well tell a little bit of the story because it's a pretty good
It's
one.
a great story. Yeah, I was very impressed with both the
Yeah.
stories you're sharing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So, the way the sweat lodge works is everyone gets together first and shares in order to, in a sense, relieve themselves of any biases, prejudices, grievances, so that when they enter the sacred space of the inipi, the sweat lodge, they're not bringing that with them.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the, indigenous peoples there was just, I mean, Stan Groff could feel the hatred beaming from this guy, and he brought it into the ceremony. And I can only imagine, under the influence of peyote, how much it may have been magnified, and how the feelings could have gotten their claws in. But how afterwards one of the participants said something honoring everybody and how grateful they were. And they mentioned Stan Grof, who is a native Czechoslovakian, I guess today it would be Czech Republican. And this guy who had just been beaming hatred over the whites and their genocide of the Native American Indian tribes, that when he heard that Grof was from Czechoslovakia, he burst into tears and threw himself at his feet. And it turned out that he had been a bomber pilot in World War II, and he had actually bombed a Czech city at the very end of the war in a completely unnecessary bombing raid that devastated the city. And it was one of those beautiful examples of here, he thought he was the victim to this man, and then discovered that, oh my God, no, he was actually the perpetrator. He was the killer. He had dropped the bombs that had destroyed Stan Grof's country, rather than Grof, who clearly wasn't there during the genocide of the Native Americans. The roles were reversed.
Right.
And of course, out of this came this lovely epiphany where this man said, if we can't all drop our racial biases and grievances, what hope can there be for peace in the world, or even peace within our own minds? Yeah. And that's why I tell this story. And one of my favorite lines in the book that, sometimes as a writer, things just come to you, and I'll probably choke up as I say it. I wrote something like, a shrine to a place of holiness, a holy shrine, came into being that day on the Great Plains of the United States. And it wasn't a tourist center, and you can't visit it or buy a postcard of it. But echoing, what the Course says in the section, for they have come, that there is no holier ground on earth, and where an ancient hatred becomes a present love. Mm-hmm. That there was, that's what happened. There was a place of holiness that came into being, and how amazing. And that's what we all want to be doing, mm-hmm. That creating, crafting those, opening up to allow that holiness to come through, so that what had been darkness and hatred can be exposed to the light of holiness, the light of God, the light of love, and move into forgiveness.
Exactly. So yeah, I was very moved by that story too. I was thinking about how, how we all project, the unconscious, unfounded guilt onto whatever moving target is handy, and without realizing, the depth and the breadth of that projection often. And this story was a great example of that, wasn't it?
Yeah, and projections are self-reinforcing. I mean, to the extent that we paint the other person in the image of the enemy or the offender, the perpetrator, they'll tend to behave that way in our eyes. Right. And this is why I think the awareness is such a key component in sort of the process of forgiving. Because if we're not aware of the need to forgive, if we think that grievance is fully justified and, we're going to forgive the people we love, but the people we hate, screw them, they don't deserve it, then, you might as well give it up and not try to forgive anybody. I mean, they all count. They're all equal in the eyes of the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you leave anyone out, we're basically saying that duality, has trumped oneness, and of course Miracles says, but God thinks otherwise.
And speaking of trumping and Trump, this is, the President of the United States right now in April of 2020, because people might be watching this in the future, mm-hmm. Is a source of amazing projection. And perhaps for me, one of the most important forgiveness opportunities, because it is so easy to project onto. And I think this is true no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. You can project values of power and authority and intuitive knowingness and glibness and cleverness, or you can see, supreme ignorance, arrogance, mendacity, I mean, on and on. And what you see is what's going to be there, and far better to look at, well, wait a minute, this is coming to me piped in through media. Media is always to some extent a manipulation. We watch it because it gets us interested. And I'll say something about that in a moment. But to be aware of the manipulations, whether you're watching Fox or MSNBC or some, real extreme, left-wing blogosphere thing, that we're being fed what we want. I think it's possibly preferable to get that in fiction rather than nonfiction. And there's been an interesting movement in what people read. Most people aren't aware of this, but if you went back to, say, the 1930s, the ratio of fictional books, novels, stories to nonfiction was, I don't know, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was significant. There was much, much more fiction being consumed than nonfiction. And over the decades, that has shifted and reversed to the point where now it's probably something like 10-to-1 nonfiction over fiction, which gives rise to the whole world of so-called reality television, where, nonfiction, where fiction masquerades as nonfiction.
And of course, what a metaphor that the Course would suggest about that idea, right?
I'm sorry.
What a great metaphor for what A Course in Miracles suggests, that that everything involving space and time and individuality and the whole thought system of sin, guilt, and fear is pure fiction.
Pure fiction.
In truth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The world we picture, as Bill Thetford might have said, is a world of crucifixion.
When I look in the mirror, I sometimes reframe that as Brucifixion, but I try to remember to not imply any victimhood there. So
yeah, I can't do that one with my name. So, but the danger of thinking that something is real is that you've made it real for yourself.
Right.
And now it's locked in, and it won't shift as much. We got to be aware of the projections, and we got to be aware of that there's no order of difficulty in miracles. There's no order of difficulty in forgiveness. There's no order of difficulty in relationships. All illusion is equally untrue, and truth is true. I mean, you can't even say it's equally true because there's nothing to compare it to.
Exactly.
All there is.
Pure non-duality sort of leaves our language in a little gnarled heap on the floor when we look at what we attempt to do with it, and where we can go with it, and I think that's one of the inspiring parts of the Course, is that it reminds us that where we're headed is really beyond words, and to an experience that really transcends anything we could possibly share in a temporal or a spatial way.
Yeah, and that's why it says, the goal of that a universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. The whole point of the Course, which is entirely practical, even if you're in the deepest, thickest theoretical part of the text, it's still ultimately about putting it into practice, is to begin to get the experience. And, when you have experiences of light, when other people who you thought were stuck in their personalities suddenly say something remarkable that lets you know that you're more connected to them than you had any idea of, then we begin to realize that the ego's construct of what this world is, and how cause and effect and rationality work, and the role of the past in helping us, hone our judgment and get to good judgment, that all of that is bunk. We don't know anything. And when we let go and let God, in the form of the Holy Spirit, kind of take over and do it for us, we get miracles. That really is what A Course in Miracles is about. And it's not until you begin to give those miracles and see their results, or receive those miracles and feel their results, that the Course starts making sense. Because I think, Bruce, as you and I have said many times, it's such a radical upside down take on what we all grow up with as reality that it would have to be totally insane. I mean, we would be raving psychotics here talking about this if it weren't for the fact that, darn, it works. There is a better way.
Uh-huh. And we could see peace instead of
And we could,
whatever fill in the blank this happens to be at any given moment, that
yes.
it seems to be a grievance or an upset of any sort or any magnitude, right?
Yeah, and there's our choice.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Yeah.
and it's up to us what we want to see. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And just skipping ahead to the next chapter, the Time to Forgive chapter, I think that's the one where you talk about Bill Thetford's experience with the colleague that was hiding behind the newspaper for
Arthur.
For a period of time. And I really like that one because they discovered after he decided to not make a big deal about it, at least that's my quick Cliff Note summary of it, of that account, was he realized that they shared a mutual interest in Edgar Casey after, a comment that his colleague made.
It's a great example of what we were just talking about, of people changing. So this happened during the scribing of A Course in Miracles. So, the teachings were still relatively new to Bill, and my understanding was that when this man, Arthur, who had a fair amount of resentment about Helen, that's why he was, he basically froze Bill out in a very juvenile, adolescent way, which only happens in high school and in academia.
No equivalence between the two, of course. Right?
No, you wouldn't get that in the boardroom. I mean, they'd just put the knife between the ribs, but they wouldn't, freeze someone out. So this man was not at all subtle about it. When Bill Thetford would walk into the room, he'd walk out. Bill would go into his office and he'd literally tent his copy of the New York Times in front of him and pretend to be reading or would read. And so Bill, quite correctly, I think, thought this is a great forgiveness opportunity. And what he started doing was just going into this guy's office first thing in the morning. And when the newspaper went up, talk about building a wall, Bill would just sit there and essentially meditate, hold a sense of love. I don't know what he was doing in his mind, but it was definitely not holding a grievance. And it was not trying to go defensive or rational or convince Arthur, this guy, that why was he doing this, or Helen's really a very good person. He wasn't trying to solve it at the level of cause and effect or two separate individuals in separate bodies. And at one point, Bill had an appointment early in the morning and didn't show up in this guy's office. And the guy was worried. He was like, uh-oh, where's Thetford? And he started asking around, and then he realized, oh, okay, he's okay. He just had an appointment. But their relationship shifted. The newspaper came down. They became friends. An ancient hatred became a present love. The validation of that for Bill, and what you were talking about with the Casey thing, Bruce, was that they were attending a conference together where the hotel had overbooked, and there were too many participants at the conference for the number of hotel rooms. And so the hotel asked people to pair up and share rooms if they were willing. And Arthur came over to Bill and said, listen, I know a lot of people here. You're the only one I would want to share a room with. Are you willing? And Bill said, of course. So while they were waiting for their room to be prepared, they went into the bar and they, I guess, got drinks. This being the 1960s, the era of Mad Men. Of course, what do you do while you're waiting for your hotel room but get a cocktail? And while they're at the bar, Arthur gets the little tray of almonds, takes 6 of them out, pushes 3 over to Bill, and keeps 3 for himself, and says, Edgar Casey told me that if you eat 3 almonds a day, you won't get cancer. And Bill almost falls off of his bar stool, of course, because Bill had been reading Casey. He knew all about this, because as they were trying to make sense of what happened to Helen, they went far and wide for similar kinds of people and experiences. Not only that, he'd been down to Virginia Beach and met Casey's son, Hugh Lynn, And so he was like, Casey told you this? And Arthur says, oh, yeah. When I was stationed in the Navy, I was in Virginia Beach and I met Edgar Casey. I used to go over to his house every Sunday and we'd have breakfast together. And for Bill, it wasn't like, wow, we have this. That was the cherry on the sundae. The forgiveness had already happened. That recognition was the recognition of, oh my, this was here all along and I never would have seen it had I not forgiven. I never would have known, that at least in this regard, we are really aligned. So it was a pretty crazy, lovely example, and I know a powerful one, for Bill.
Yeah. Another great story, and a reminder that, ultimately all of our grievances are unfounded, and if we only knew, could kind of practice that everyone's fighting the same hard battle, even though the form may be very different, and in terms of the particulars, but the same two thought systems are having this, our decision maker, I should say, is having this tug of war or struggle or whatever between these two completely contradictory thought systems, only one of which is completely sane.
Yeah.
So very helpful story. Anything else? Is because you mentioned the purpose of the Holy Spirit giving us time to change our mind and find our way to forgiveness in that chapter. I thought that was a particularly,
this is one of my big things,
phrase,
and it's probably coming out of my psychotherapy work, where there certainly have been people I've worked with where I would sit back at the end of the session after they left the room and go, why am I bothering? This is impossible. This will never change. But having made a commitment and being a diligent student of A Course in Miracles, I stick with it and stay in a loving place. And lo and behold, over the course of time, change does happen and things soften and people become more loving and more forgiving. So I think we often forget that the moment we thought we separated, we also were instantaneously rejoined with our true self, which is even that isn't an accurate way of saying it, because it presumes that we could leave. In our, crazy fever dream of separation, we were cured of the disease the instant it happened. And the Course makes clear we're reliving this one moment of time, the time of terror, over and over and over and over, and we string it out so it looks linear, and here's the past and here's the future, and we're moving along that line from here to here. In the Holy Spirit's eyes, there's only one purpose for being here, there's only one function, and there's only one use of time: to learn how to forgive, to learn how to recognize in your brother the holiness that is also in you. I think the Course is the only metaphysical system, at least the only one I'm aware of, that says you can only recognize your own holiness truly by seeing it in the face of your brother. Not literally the face, although that too. So, it's a pitfall of newer Course students, but also older ones, to say, I want to do this. I get it. I want to rush through this. Bring it on, Holy Spirit. Lay it on me. I can handle it. Because that's not how you build your forgiveness muscles. That's the ego saying, I want to do this. I love it. And I'm going to be the first person to forgive everyone and
in record time,
graduate from the Course. So I'm very fond of reminding people that's what time is for. Take the time. I came on a line just the other day where the Course made one of its wonderful puns and double entendres about, forgive, and I'm paraphrasing, but forgiveness, it's only a matter of time, which is both literal and figurative. Yes, it is. It's just a matter of time. And, the purpose of miracles is to shorten time, to condense time. The Course tells us forgiveness is the home of miracles. That is a direct quote. When we forgive, we condense time, we shorten it. Bill and Arthur could have, who knows, hated each other, sniped at each other, criticized each other's papers, given one or the other a heart attack, and had to come back in some other lifetime and do it all again as brother and sister. Who knows? Mm-hmm. But time got condensed, and in a matter of X number of months, boom, it's gone. It's healed. So time, when used for the Holy Spirit's purposes, is our friend. As the Course says in chapter 16, the Bridge to Reality, time is, when used for the Holy Spirit, is gentle. Fear not that you will be lifted up and hurled into reality. You never get a lesson or a conflict presented to you for forgiveness that you're not ready to handle, because the ego will make sure you don't see it if you're not ready, and so will the Holy Spirit. If you're not ready, you're not ready. And sometimes, and this is, I think, is one of the things that I really respect in 12-step work, you can be aware of the need to forgive and also know you're not ready. Mm-hmm. You know, in a story that I think I've told in every book I ever write, and probably will tell over and over, is of a woman I worked with who'd suffered horrific childhood abuse, multiple perpetrators, and how we were doing, well, we weren't doing imagery work. She just saw what had happened very, very vividly and took it in a different direction in the course of the therapy, and was doing extremely violent, bloody things to her perpetrator. And I'm sitting there going, well, you know, this sure isn't A Course in Miracles. This sure isn't loving. But my gut said, no, she needs to go through this. It's a matter of time. And I do tell this in From Loving One to One Love. At a certain point, it just became old. She didn't need to do it anymore. Mm-hmm. It dropped away. And when I checked back in at some point later, well, how are you feeling about that guy? She was like, yeah, you know, well, what he did happened. You know, I don't like it. I wish it didn't, but there it is. So what? It had been integrated into what, you know, as a psychiatrist, what I would call normal memory rather than traumatic memory. And it didn't bring up any emotion in the same way. But had I said to her, look, he's your brother, you're both holy sons of God, you need to just forgive him and let it go, I suspect she would have walked out of my office right then and there and never returned, and maybe posted a few comments on my website or who knows what. That we can't go faster than we're ready to go.
So you're making a big deal out of it. Would have made it an even bigger deal for her, perhaps.
Yeah, and would have made her wrong.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
I would have been telling her that what you're feeling is wrong, and what I'm telling you is right, and there is a judgment in that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, we need to allow people the space and the time to go through what they're going to go through in the best way that the Holy Spirit knows for them. We don't know what that is. But if we're quiet, if we go inward, if we say, you know, help me to know what to say to this brother or what to do, more often than not, you're going to get, you know, say nothing, be at peace, you know, think loving thoughts. But occasionally you will get something different, and, you know, there's your guidance. But the moment, you know, and the place where you see this the most, sadly, is in Course in Miracles groups, where someone's going through something that's really tough, and 3 people are ganging up on them, telling them how they just don't get A Course in Miracles because all they have to do is forgive. It's true in the big picture, but they're not there yet.
Right. We wouldn't need the remedial curriculum of A Course in Miracles if we were already aware completely of what it's helping us to remember.
Yeah. And we don't know what anybody else's path is. I think that's one of the most important things. We certainly don't even know what our own path is.
Right.
So what
let alone anyone else's. Right?
Yeah. To think that, you know, that someone else should forgive someone or not. You know, when we give things to the Holy Spirit, maybe the person with the terrible grievance isn't supposed to work it out in psychotherapy. Maybe the Holy Spirit will orchestrate it that person comes back into their life in some way forgiving them, asking for forgiveness, acknowledging it. I'd heard a story back when I was doing a lot of work with early childhood trauma about a woman who'd been tortured by her mother. I don't even remember the specifics, but I remember it was pretty horrible and pretty violent. And one day, and she'd cut the mother out of her life completely appropriately. And at some point, she allowed the mother in a little bit. And the mother said, "I'm so sorry. I know what I did to you. I was floridly psychotic. I didn't get treatment for X number of months or years or whatever. I am really sorry." Now that carries a lot more weight than any therapist working with any patient or client. So we just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when we know we don't know, now we're in a position to receive.
Yeah. And we need to be patient with ourselves until we get to that place of not knowing, I suppose.
Yeah, look, we're going to make the judgments. I mean, and we all do think we know better. I mean, let's face it. Anyone who's, living with a partner can tell you that, of course, they know the right way to do it, and their partner is an idiot. And, for the sake of the marriage or the relationship, they're not going to tell them that. But I once worked with a couple who I was very, very fond of. And he was one of these guys who could think like, 30 moves ahead. Life was an ongoing chess game. And he took great delight in it. It wasn't ultimately he was coming from a fear place, but he wasn't aware of the fear behind it. And one day, his wife got a flat tire out on the road, and he was telling her, do this, do this, do this, do this. And she was a pretty strong lady. So she basically, like in her mind, said, "Oh, screw off." And she did it her way. And she got, it all got handled. And when he found out that she hadn't done it his way, he was really angry. And in therapy together, we kind of looked at it, and where he ultimately got to, and it was really quite lovely, was kind of this epiphany of, wow, she didn't do it my way, and it still worked out. She was able to do it on her own. Which obviously was more empowering for her and was the lesson that he needed to learn.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm looking ahead to chapter 14, Shadows and Mirrors, Relationships as Reflections of Self, which that just the title in itself says a lot. And then, you begin with projection as a cornerstone of the ego's approach to relationships. And there's so much to be said about that. Maybe you could dive into some of the inspirations that led to this chapter.
So this chapter came out of a talk I did years ago about Groundhog Day. And in fact, I did it again just this year. So if you want to hear some of that, look at my February webinar on the Foundation for Inner Peace website under events, or better still, go to our YouTube channel. But Bruce and I are both fond of metaphor. I like coming up with sort of imagistic ways of understanding things. And so I, years and years and years ago, started playing with the idea of Groundhog Day and the shadow. And this whole idea that if the light is too strong, you see your shadow when you go back into hiding, which is kind of what we were just saying about, the lift it's too strong a lift. You're not ready for it. But that in the dimmer light, not the absence of light, because there's always light. The groundhog never comes out at night. I mean, he's too smart for that. But in the dimmer light, it's possible for the groundhog to come out and be comfortable. So I'm playing with the idea of shadows, and then I go into the whole notion of the Jungian shadow, which are the disowned aspects of our personal and our collective selves that we don't like to acknowledge. In the story I told about Stan Groff and the Potawatomi tribesmen, his shadow side was the fact that he was a bomber pilot in World War II and was responsible for the deaths of probably thousands of people. He didn't want to look at that. He projected it out onto the white race, and in this context, onto Stan Groff in particular. The beauty of it is that the peyote ceremony is a healing ceremony, and it brought him exactly what he needed. as these powerful intentions will do. So I'm playing with shadows, and I'm playing with the idea of mirrors, because the Course tells us your brother is the mirror of yourself. And that unlike, well, the problem with projection is that once we have projected our shadow side or the negative impulses that we don't want to look at in ourselves, we no longer see them as part of us. They're out there. They belong to that gal, that guy. And now we can react to them as other. We've eliminated them. We've vomited them out of our system, and we don't have to deal with them except in terms of how they show up with other people. So if you're going to forgive what you have projected, first, you have to see the projection. So we're back to awareness. Second, you have to re-own it. And this is the hard part. That's what happened in the healing with Graf and the Potawatomi guy. He had projected it out. In an instant, he saw the projection and he re-owned it completely. And it totally blew up the grievance and opened the door wide to forgiveness. So we have to see the projection. We have to own it as ours, in a sense, taking it back, because we can't work with it if it's out there on someone else. Right. And once it's ours, then we can look at it and say, all right, this is ripe for forgiveness. And in that sense, everybody becomes an opportunity to show us something in ourselves that we don't want to see. And if we idolize them, then we get to see the specialness that for some reason we put on them, rather than owning our own holiness and the fact that each one of us has a sacred function given to us by the Holy Spirit that only we can do. And outside the world of form, that is forgiveness. And it's always the same. Inside the world of form, it is unique to you, to your personality, to the time you live in, to the social culture and context that you operate in. Only you can reach the people that you live with and know better than anyone else. If we're seeing specialness in someone else, that's what we're denying in ourselves. If we see a grievance, then obviously, there's the negative shadow. So this goes to lesson 134, where we're told to ask ourselves, would I accuse myself of this? I had someone the other day who has not a terribly good sense of self-esteem say to me, what's the point of that lesson? Of course I'd accuse myself of that, and way worse. But it is a way of taking back the projection. Would I accuse myself of this is a way of saying, oh, I was seeing it out there on my husband, my wife, my partner, my child, my president, my boss. And when you ask yourself, would I accuse myself of what I'm seeing in them, you're taking back the projection. The metaphor of the mirrors is, I think it's just quite lovely. And I always play with the idea that the ego's world is both a fun house that's not so fun, or as I call it in the book, a not so fun house.
I like that, yeah.
Where we look around and we see distorted images of ourselves, because instead of the Holy Son of God, we see this body, and the body is too fat, too thin, too tall, too skinny, too weird eyes, too awkward a mouth, you name it. And it's also a hall of mirrors, because we get lost and we bump into these other images of ourselves that we're seeing everywhere, but we can't find our way through them because we still, we can't embrace them as self. So I play with a lot of this stuff in that chapter. It was a very playful chapter, probably a little self-indulgent, but I enjoyed writing it, and I hope people enjoy reading it.
Yeah, I like the fact that you brought up again from your previous book the DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder, because it seems like that's just such a, I think a really useful, powerful concept of how, the ego's, standard procedure is dissociation, and in order to take the unconscious, unfounded guilt and throw it out there, and then okay, now I can wash my hands of this and and presumably and go on about my day, not having to think about, the festering, illusion really, but we don't see it that way until we look at it. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is it possible to go through A Course in Miracles and get it and learn it and practice it without understanding dissociation? Of course it is. But if you really understand the concept of dissociation, which appears in numerous places in the text, but the most prominent one being the section called Sharing Perception with the Holy Spirit, but I forget what chapter it's in. I think it might be 14, I don't know. If you understand dissociation, all of this makes so much more sense. And I actually think, okay, so sometimes, you get to look back and you go, why did I take the path that I took in life? And why were certain learnings presented to me to get me where I am? Well, during my residency, I got very interested in multiple personality, which is called dissociative identity disorder. The very first outpatient I had suffered from this condition, but I didn't realize it for about 2 years, which is not at all uncommon. I had a psychotherapy supervisor, mentor, who was all into this. And I often ask myself, yeah, it's not as rare a condition as people think, but it's certainly not like it's common.
Mm-hmm.
Why did I get so much of this? And now, in retrospect, I have a very, very solid understanding of how dissociation works. I also taught hypnosis to psychiatric residents, used it in my practice with pain patients quite a bit. And hypnosis is simply a way of inducing sort of a therapeutic dissociation, or if it's a stage hypnotist, an untherapeutic form of dissociation. So if you understand dissociation, and we're not going to go into it today, read chapter 5 of From Nevermind to Evermind, and I think I lay it out pretty clearly. But you're right, I forgot that I do bring it up again in this book with that idea that we're looking out and seeing other people as different, just as the alter personalities in multiple personality disorder see each other as different and see each other as horrible rivals or enemies, or this one's my friend, but that one's out to kill me. And yet they're all part of the same beingness. They're all part of the same mind. And I think it's a wonderful metaphor for understanding our predicament. I actually also think it's quite accurate. I think it's a metaphor that melts into the actual of what happened and how we are in the predicament we're in. Mm-hmm. We are dissociating our true self in order to pretend that we can live in this dream world. So thank you for reminding me of that, Bruce. That
sure. I just think it's such a useful concept because we're, if the the course of the metaphysics of the course suggests that we've basically in our minds only, in our ego minds only, believe we pulled off this unimaginably vast fragmentation and dissociation, and unless we consciously, somewhat proactively, ask for guidance and help from what the course calls Holy Spirit to pull the pieces back together and recognize that it didn't happen, we're going to continue to blame through the mechanism of projection all the stuff that we don't want to see in our own mind, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we're gonna project it for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
We're dissociated. And so in the first part of the book, I talked about shame a lot, which Helen and Bill would not have been familiar with. It was not part of the psychoanalytic world. But projection and dissociation, two defense mechanisms, were very much a part of psychoanalytic understanding. And so Helen and Bill would have been extremely familiar with them. Mm-hmm. And they are used throughout A Course in Miracles quite properly in terms of the psychoanalytic understanding. Yeah. Only, of course, A Course in Miracles takes it much, much further because it's not just projecting unacceptable impulses as an ego in a body. It's, as you said, Bruce, going right to the Son of God, having this dissociative dream and falling, Adam falling into a deep sleep, and nowhere does it say that he awoke.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, and then the last chapter that I was reading, talking about applied forgiveness where the rubber meets the road is putting it, what's the litmus test, of making sure that, every person we meet has an opportunity to work with our forgiveness, not on their terms, but it's my forgiveness opportunity.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So what I do in that, I mean, over the years, over the decades, and I'm sure many of you have evolved in the same way, you discover certain ways that help you to get to forgiveness. Maybe it's certain images, there's a lovely Buddhist practice that I've adapted in my own ways that I heard from Bob Thurman on a tape, where you see everyone as your loving mother in a different lifetime. So how would you react to your loving mother, if Trump were your loving mother, if so-and-so were? I, for myself, even though I have a wonderfully loving mother,
who I had the pleasure to meet earlier this year.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a delight.
Mm-hmm.
And even though she's not a student of the course, now she lives in the same development as Judy Whitson, and she's picked up all of the lingo, and she'll say, "Yeah, let's ask the Holy Spirit about that," and it's delightful, and it's mind-blowing, and it's yet another example. Now that you mention it, I'd never thought of this, where I didn't try to do anything. If I had tried to, convert my mother to A Course in Miracles, there's no way it would have happened. And yet, and I see this as a reflection of my own inner work, the outer world shifts to mirror it. And suddenly, speaking of shadows and mirrors, here's my mother talking Course in Miracles. It's quite astounding. But so for me, rather than trying to visualize my mother, I recognize if we're all the same, I think of it in terms of what if we were all identical twins, and everywhere you go, every face you see is really just your own face. And not only that, you're identical twins who grew up in the same way. There's that mind meld, and your experiences and their experiences are identical. And, can you see people through that lens? Some people have told me, yeah, it doesn't work for them, and that's fine. I'm just offering these as little, sort of mini practices that might help. One person I did a podcast with recently said, "Oh my God, I think that was the most helpful thing I've heard in a long time." These are just things that I've come up with for myself, where in this book, I thought, yeah, I'd like to share them. And as long as we're talking, I might as well, there are a number of metaphors that I wanted to go into more detail, and yet in writing the book, it was kind of like they just don't need more detail. So I often find it helpful to think of forgiveness as a universal solvent. This is the chemistry part of my brain as a doctor coming forward. And a universal solvent can work two ways. You can have a beaker of it, and whatever the grievance is, you put it in the beaker and it just dissolves it away. That would be God, the Holy Spirit, as a vast ocean or whatever it is, and you can just take that moment that was so difficult, or that person who's so difficult, and give them a bath and let them come out, clean and sparkling and full of light, just the way God created them, which would of course mean no body. But it's a universal solvent. Or you can get your little eyedropper of forgiveness, or your squirt gun, and squirt forgiveness all over people, and watch it dissolve away the grime and the gunk and all those things that you didn't like. It's not that they had it, it's that you saw it there, and your forgiveness cleans it off of them. I also can think of forgiveness as an autocorrect feature where, we spelled it wrong. Holy Spirit tells us, no. Here's how to do it, and just autocorrects our vision as we go along. So a lot of these nifty little, ways of thinking about it and understanding it that I've just found helpful for myself and wanted to share.
And they are very helpful too. Yeah, I like metaphors, and also any mnemonic devices that help us jog our memory. Earlier today, in a course study group that I started about a decade, 12 years ago, I guess now, on Wednesday nights. One of the people the other night was saying, that they were asking, what's a Course in Miracles about, and she said, well, being relaxed, just relaxing, and I thought, well, I could kind of meditate on the bit, and then this morning, as I was putting on my jeans, I looked down and saw a label on the inside that said "Relaxed Fit."
Wow.
Okay, there's a mnemonic device. I mean, we can use anything as a reminder if we're paying attention and looking for it. So I
Yeah.
shot her an email along with the rest of the group and say, hey, it's all where you're willing to look, and another fellow who lives in Colorado was saying he was wanting to figure something out, and he was kind of cogitating over this thing, and he looked up and saw this sign that was Ask Insurance, and it was the name of the company, and so
That's
that was
great.
his little triggers, like, okay, I just need to ask the right teacher.
And you will
so
get
so we get all these little mnemonic hits if we're memory jog devices, if we're just paying attention to them. And
that. It's a beautiful example. We get what will work for us on our path. And if it works for someone else as well, then that's terrific, because minds are joined in forgiveness.
Yep.
But what works for you? I mean, Judy Whitson used to get stuff. I mean, California has personalized license plates, so people can put up all kinds of stuff. And I wish I could remember some of the things, the stories she's told, where she'll be driving along and, dealing with something, and, the car in front has peace as the license plate. I mean, I'm making that up, but well, guidance, the Holy Spirit is not limited to being a voice. Yes, that is how the Course conceptualizes him. And I think it trains us specifically, especially those early workbook lessons, to hear him as a voice in our head, because the ego operates as a voice in our head, the internal monologue that, do this, do that. Oh, what about this? So the Holy Spirit is an antidote to that voice, but the guidance of the Holy Spirit is by no means limited. And, I'll often find, and I'm sure this is, the case for you as it is for Judy, that sometimes you don't get the voice, but if you still give it to the Holy Spirit, that personalized license plate or the sign, or, you happen to open A Course in Miracles to a particular page, and holy cow, there's that line that tells you exactly what you needed, or some other book, or a character on a TV show.
Or a lyric or song, or, it could be anything.
Song lyrics. Yes, absolutely. Because they're coming through the right brain too. You'll get the guidance. But ultimately, we want to cultivate a mind frame of receptivity to guidance, which is, I don't know the best way to proceed. I know who does know. Take it from me and give me some guidance.
Yeah. And it does seem like in another, area of rubber meets the road, practical, how to apply the Course. A lot of it is just remembering to be gently vigilant, and as my buddy Dave's example was, just to notice that we didn't always need to ask. We just need to ask and allow that guidance to come through, and practice being receptive to learning that there's a better way, and we could see peace instead of this, and then we're not upset for the reason we think.
What I've found personally, and maybe this will change, is that the more I've put A Course in Miracles into practice and made it the mainstay of my life, the less personally I need to sit and ask, what do I do about this or that? Rather, as per the rules of decision chapter, section of chapter 30, it's more like, set your mind in the right place at the beginning of the day. It tells us we never make decisions alone. We're always basically choosing with the ego or with Holy Spirit. So if you set your mind to choosing with Holy Spirit, the guidance and the decisions will flow. That said, what I also have experienced, really just since taking my role with the foundation, is that in group settings, asking consciously, intentionally, is an extremely valuable tool, because you can have the discussion and you can you frame the question, but then if everyone in that group lets it all go and says, I'm here only to be truly helpful, and I want the answer that is the accurate one, you will get that. I mean, right down to, I can think of 2 occasions with the foundation where we had to come up with a payment, an amount of money for someone. And I'm not talking like a small amount of money. I'm talking about a very large amount of money for translations. And one I was not a part of, but heard about with people who were not even part of the foundation. The other was much more recent, where we were told by a translator, I don't want any part of this. Whatever you guys get, I will accept. And both times, the numbers that came through were shockingly aligned. So, it's one thing that we all, oh yeah, let's choose peace over love. And, I mean, those are all good, but the Course tells us that you will get specific answers to specific problems as long as you think problems are specific. And in a group setting, here's how to think about it. If you all agree to ask, that is the alignment right there. You might have profound differences about the content, but if you all agree as Course students, we don't really know, and you align to do the ask, now you are moving back toward one-mindedness and forgiveness, and the Holy Spirit's best answer will come through you. And you might each get a different piece of it, a different refraction. You'll certainly have your own ways of getting it. Some will be more auditory, some will get visions and images, pictures, sometimes very funny pictures. Some people would just get a feeling like, yeah, I just feel like this is the way to go. But the sensory modality that you process it with, it doesn't matter. You've set an intention that you don't know as a group or an individual, and what comes through is good. So in group settings, I still think it's worthwhile doing the ask. Individually, if you're really flummoxed, do it. But most of the time, I think if you've done A Course in Miracles long enough, the rules for decision rules apply.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and one last topic, unless you have other things you want to share, that we talked about before we started the recording, and that is you mentioned the word frame, and that reminded me of the reframe, which is a word that you used in some of the writing I just read in your book, and I was realizing the other day what a great metaphor that is for expanding our finite definition of self to include others in the capital S self. And even if we just do it a few people or a group or whatever at a time, just metaphorically, we're holding the intention that we ask for guidance to extend the boundaries of self to include ultimately oneness, but certainly sameness, and extending that sameness and sharedness to include at least the people that we seem to be having issues or conflicts or questions about, and so I found that really helpful in the what I call the 3 R's of forgiveness. It's a little mnemonic that I use of I was using reveal, release, and replace, but I was thinking reframe actually works really, really well for that first step of taking my little sense of self that says there's a problem out there. If I reframe it to include these alleged others in my sense of self, then it's like, okay, it's no longer making it about they're doing something to me. I'm no longer the victim, or at the mercy of. I'm now able to be merciful by reframing the situation. It's like bring it back to my mind, and then I just have to ask the right teacher in my mind to then release the grievance that I might be having, and then the replacement is automatic, and the Holy Spirit does the replacement. So
yeah.
So I like the reveal, release, replace is one of my new updated mnemonics.
Another R.
Yeah.
The 3 R's.
Yeah.
Maybe 4. I don't know.
Maybe 4 or 5. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Bruce and I were talking about this just before we started the recording, And, in psychotherapy, a reframe, and I talk about this in one of the chapters in part 1, a reframe is just, okay, you saw it a certain way based on your narrow understanding of things, at the time, especially if you were younger. And you can reframe it in light of more information, more awareness of the greater context, etc. And in that reframing of it, it no longer has the bite that it once had. You have a greater understanding and therefore a greater capacity to release it and forgive it. But ultimately, and you were, I thank you for this one, Bruce. Well, I mean, I do say it as well. The ultimate reframe, and that is what I call it, is the Holy Spirit's vision, because there's only one ultimate context, which is, your dream never happened. You're still the Son of God. I am as God created me. And so if we can get it out to that level, then everything in the dream gets reframed the same way, and we're good to go. We're good to return. So, reframes work within the dream, but then there is that ultimate reframe of the Holy Spirit. And that's why we turn it over to the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit has the big picture and we do not.
Beautifully said. Thank you. And speaking of beautifully said, unless there's something else you want to share, I again want to encourage people to get a copy of your latest book, because it is really beautifully done and eloquent and very accessible, and it reframes things very nicely. So anyway,
Thank you.
thanks
Yeah,
again.
it's also available as an audiobook for those who don't like
Great.
to read but prefer to listen.
Great.
I think that tab is available on Amazon and on audible.com. I don't know whether it's available on other audio platforms or not. This is all the publishers doing, not mine. But I do know that there are many people, Judy Whitson has a great deal of trouble reading now because of eye issues, but she sure does listen to those books, and some people like listening as they're going to bed at night. So you can access it in multiple media.
Great.
And then as an author, the one thing I would, ask people is, if you have the book, if you read it, if you like it, please consider writing a review of any length on Amazon. This is what helps people know what's in a book. I can put up all the endorsements in the world, but we all know those endorsements come from people or friends or people, who you've interacted with. Whereas the unvarnished, honest thoughts of other readers really sink in. And for whatever reason, this book has not gotten really many, if any, reviews. And it might just because it's that new, but I would make that appeal to anyone listening, just an author's plea. Not so much for myself, the idea that I'll see royalties from any of my books is very unlikely. Let's just put it that way. But as an author who puts a great deal of time, thought, and energy into these, you kind of want them to be able to reach the audience that could benefit from them. And, and we're all in this together. So
Absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah, very much so.
And I thank you, Bruce, for hosting these.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah, I'm enjoying the conversations as well as the reading and reflection.
Yeah,
immensely.
Me too. And, I think if we do another one, I don't think there's a lot left in the book, but maybe we can, circle back or just let it go wherever it wants to go, and then we'll be done.
That sounds good.
But putting these up on YouTube, I think, has been very valuable for people who, just want to listen in and don't know. And, there's so many books out there, who the heck wants to, get another book and put it on your pile of to read someday books.
This is already in my to be reread pile. So
thank you. Blessings, brother.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have actually had the thought that I would like to listen to it in the audiobook because it goes in a different direction. And sort of take in my own words from that different perspective. And I think I'm going to do that one of these days.
That sounds good. You know, it's interesting. Sometimes I'll look at the recordings, and, you know, look and or listen to the recordings I've put on acimblog.com, and occasionally I'll hear myself saying something. Well, where'd that come from? I don't remember
Right.
saying that. But I think as the more we attune ourselves to guidance from the Holy Spirit, you know, it's not coming from us; it's coming through us. And I think that's something I noticed years ago when I was teaching an adult school class back in the late 70s, early 80s. Uh, and it's like, where did that, you know, you kind of notice when you're getting yourself out of the way that things come through. And in those moments, it's like, wow, that's not bad. I wish somebody had told me that before, kind of thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, I can totally relate to having, you know, reread some of the stuff I've written and shared. And if you know, when we were successful at getting ourselves out of the way, you know, it's not only has the potential to help others, but you know, we can benefit
We can benefit
tremendously.
ourselves.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. I could apply this stuff that's coming through me. What a concept.
And there is something about, listening and reading are
Yeah,
different processes. I mean,
yeah.
when I go out for a walk and do the audio Course in Miracles, I'm always hearing things. I'm like, wait a minute, did I read that?
Mm-hmm,
It
mm-hmm.
just comes through. And then, of course, I'll go back to my book, and sure enough, it's starred, or no, I didn't. And
Mm-hmm.
here's, my next, 3022nd favorite line in the Course.
Yeah.
So the different modalities can certainly be very helpful.
Yeah. And it also ties into what we were sharing earlier about how, you know, we're all ready for different uh, you know, things at different times, and we need to be patient with ourselves, and when those things do come around, it's like, oh my gosh, that was in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Not to be surprised. Yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
Now you're inspiring me to carry out and follow through on that plan to do the audiobook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thanks again, Bob. I always enjoy our conversations and look forward to the next one. And I'll post the YouTube link up on ACIM blog and send you all this stuff. And looking forward to the next conversation. So thanks
Thank you
again.
so much. Thank you, Bruce. And thank